The billionaire had eaten at tables most people would never see, private rooms above cities, boardrooms disguised as restaurants, yachts where chefs cooked in silence while negotiations unfolded between bites. But this table was different. This table was home. It stretched long and polished beneath the chandelier, its surface reflecting warm candlelight and quiet confidence. Crystal glasses stood in perfect alignment. Silverware rested untouched, sharp and deliberate. Every detail had been arranged hours earlier, not for spectacle, but for control. Control mattered to him. It always had. The mansion was unusually still that evening. Not the kind of silence that came from emptiness, but the kind that came from people waiting for permission to breathe, waiting for the man at the head of the table to sit. He arrived last. He always did. Not because he wanted to make an entrance, but because the room needed to feel complete only when he was there. The billionaire moved with the unhurried precision of someone who had nothing to prove and everything to lose. His posture was straight, his expression neutral, his eyes observant in a way that made people adjust themselves without knowing why. This was a private dinner. No press, no assistants hovering, no security visible, though security was never truly absent, only familiar faces, trusted faces, people who had earned their seats. As he took his place, the room subtly shifted. Conversations quieted, movements slowed. Even the candles seemed steadier. He looked down at the table for a moment longer than necessary, not because he was admiring it, but because something felt off. The billionaire had learned long ago to respect instincts without announcing them. Instincts had saved him during hostile takeovers, during betrayals disguised as partnerships, during years when smiling men shook his hand while planning his collapse. Still, this was dinner, at home, with people who had shared his life. He dismissed the thought. The first course was served without ceremony. The aroma was familiar, carefully chosen, safe, the kind of food that suggested comfort rather than indulgence. He took a bite. Normal. He lifted his glass next. The wine was expensive, but not rare. Selected for balance, not drama. He preferred it that way. The glass felt cool against his fingers. He drank. Still normal. Around him the table eased into quiet rhythm, the soft clink of cutlery, the low murmur of restrained conversation. The background hum of a mansion that had been lived in long enough to know its place. This was the part of the evening he usually enjoyed most, the moment before anything was required of him. No decisions, no numbers, no consequences, just the illusion of rest. It was subtle at first, so subtle that even he nearly ignored it. A faint warmth spread across his chest, slow and unfamiliar. Not pain, not discomfort, just presence, as though something had been introduced into his body without asking. He adjusted in his chair. Another sip of wine followed. The warmth didn't fade. Instead, it deepened. His breathing changed, barely, a fraction slower, a fraction heavier. He noticed it the way experienced men notice small shifts, without panic, but with attention. He set the glass down. The conversation around him continued, unaware. No one was watching closely enough yet. No one had been trained to notice what he noticed. A second sensation followed, a gentle pressure behind his eyes. Not dizziness, something worse, a distortion, as though the room had leaned forward by a degree only he could feel. He blinked once, then again. The chandelier above him seemed brighter, not sharper, brighter, like light pressing too hard against his vision. Still, he said nothing. Years of command had taught him one dangerous habit: endure first, question later. His hand moved toward his fork again, and stopped. There it was, the tremor, barely visible, just a slight hesitation before motion. The kind of thing no one would catch unless they were looking for it. But he felt it. His heart rate increased, not from fear, but calculation. He scanned the table without moving his head. Faces were calm, relaxed, familiar, too familiar. The warmth in his chest spread downward now, slow and deliberate, as though following a path already drawn. This was not accidental. That realization arrived quietly, but with certainty. Whatever was happening inside him had been measured, designed, timed. He leaned back slightly, careful not to draw attention. He took a deeper breath. It didn't help. His vision softened at the edges, the way it does just before fatigue takes over. Except he wasn't tired. He had been sharp all day, clear, focused. The room hadn't changed. He had. The billionaire placed both hands flat on the table, grounding himself, testing his strength. It was still there, but it was slipping, a drop at a time. Someone laughed softly down the table, a normal sound, a harmless sound. It felt distant. His mouth opened, just slightly, as if to speak. No words came, not because he couldn't talk, but because his body hadn't decided whether it was safe to try. That was when the first true wave hit. A sudden tightening. His chest compressed as though a belt had been pulled from the inside. His breath shortened. His pulse spiked hard enough to be undeniable. He lowered his head, not in defeat, in concealment. For the first time that night, someone noticed. A pause in conversation, a shift in attention. Not alarm yet, just curiosity. The billionaire raised his head slowly. The effort felt heavier than it should have. He managed to steady his expression. Years of discipline held it in place, even as his body betrayed him. "I'm fine," his silence said, even though he hadn't spoken. But something in his eyes disagreed. The warmth had turned invasive now. His limbs felt distant. His fingertips tingled, as though sensation were being siphoned away. This was not meant to kill him quickly. That truth settled in with chilling clarity. Fast deaths were sloppy, obvious, uncontrollable. This was something else. This was meant to happen while people watched. The room hadn't erupted yet. Panic had not arrived. The dinner continued its fragile imitation of normalcy. But the billionaire knew. The dinner was already over, and whatever happened next would not be about survival. It would be about who took control while he couldn't stop them. Long before the mansion learned his footsteps, before the chandeliers and the quiet authority of wealth, the billionaire learned something far more important. He learned how easily people underestimated silence. He was not born into legacy. There were no portraits of ancestors watching over him, no inherited power waiting patiently for his name. There was only observation. As a boy, he learned to sit still and listen while others spoke too much. He noticed how confidence was often mistaken for competence, and how loud people were rarely the ones in control. He learned that rooms rewarded certainty, even when it was false, and punished hesitation more harshly than ignorance. By the time he entered the world of business, he already understood something many never did. Power did not announce itself. It accumulated quietly. His first success was small, not a headline, not a celebration, just a transaction that worked, a decision others avoided, a risk he calculated when no one was watching. He didn't chase admiration. he chased leverage. While others spent their early years trying to look important, he focused on becoming necessary. He built relationships that were invisible to outsiders, partnerships that didn't appear in articles, agreements made in hallways, in cars, in moments when guards and assistants were absent. And when the first betrayal came, and it did come early, he did not react emotionally. He reacted structurally. He learned that betrayal was not personal. It was predictive. People showed you who they were long before they acted. You just had to be patient enough to watch. That patience became the foundation of his empire. Years passed. Success stacked quietly on success. His name began to surface, not loudly, but persistently. He became known as someone who finished what others started, someone who didn't overextend, someone who never needed to raise his voice to end a conversation. His wealth grew not because he chased it, but because it followed his consistency, and with wealth came isolation, not immediately. Isolation arrives slowly. It disguises itself as efficiency, as privacy, as protection. Meetings became smaller, circles tighter, trust became selective. By the time people realized how powerful he was, they no longer had access to him. He married during his ascent, not out of strategy, out of timing. The relationship was real, but it existed alongside ambition, not above it. Love lived in the margins of his schedule, carefully maintained, but never allowed to interfere with momentum. Children came later. By then, he was already a man accustomed to absence. He loved them, deeply, but in a way shaped by distance. His presence was felt more than it was experienced. He provided stability, opportunity, protection, but rarely vulnerability. That was his blind spot. He believed protection was enough. As the empire expanded, so did the list of people who depended on him. Employees, partners, entire markets. His decisions moved thousands of lives, sometimes millions, without him ever seeing their faces. That kind of power reshapes the way a man sees the world. Problems become abstract. Risk becomes normalized. Threats become theoretical. And slowly, danger begins to feel distant. He survived corporate wars that destroyed louder men. He watched rivals fall to greed, impatience, and ego. He stayed disciplined, conservative when others were reckless, calm when others panicked. People called him untouchable. He never did. He knew better. But over time, even caution can erode, not because danger disappears, but because it changes form. Enemies no longer arrived with lawsuits and press conferences. They arrived with smiles, with reassurances, with patience. Some wanted his money, some wanted his influence, some wanted what would remain after him. Legacy attracts a different kind of hunger. As the years passed, his focus shifted, not away from control, but toward continuity. He began thinking less about expansion and more about preservation. Structures, succession, legal frameworks designed to outlive him. This was the phase of his life where mistakes mattered more, because now a single oversight didn't just threaten profits, it threatened everything he would leave behind. The mansion became central during this time, a symbol of arrival, a place designed for permanence. It was meant to be safe, predictable, controlled. He believed that danger lived outside its walls. That belief cost him, because the closer someone is allowed to get, the less they need to force their way in. And slowly, without confrontation, control began to loosen. Not in boardrooms, not in contracts, but in assumptions. Assumptions about loyalty, about gratitude, about patience. He had built an empire that could survive markets, governments, and rivals. What he hadn't built was immunity from those who understood him best. As the dinner table scene replayed in his fading awareness, one truth pressed harder than the symptoms in his body. This moment was not about his past enemies. It was about his future, and someone at that table had decided they were tired of waiting. The collapse did not happen all at once. That was the most dangerous part. If the billionaire had fallen to the floor, if panic had erupted instantly, control would have remained visible, obvious, loud. Emergency protocols would have taken over. Decisions would have been forced into the open. But instead his body failed gradually, and gradual failure creates opportunity. He was escorted away from the table with practiced calm, not urgency, yet. Chairs slid back quietly, voices lowered instinctively, as though volume itself might make the situation real. Someone suggested air. Someone else suggested rest. The word emergency was avoided entirely. Upstairs, the mansion felt larger than it ever had before. The corridors stretched longer. The lights were dimmer. The silence heavier. Every step echoed with a weight that had nothing to do with sound. The billionaire was laid back against pillows that smelled like linen and certainty. His breathing was uneven now, shallow in places, deeper in others, as though his body could no longer agree on its own rhythm. Time slowed. That was when the war began. Not with raised voices or accusations, but with movement. Phones appeared, quietly, casually, messages sent with faces carefully arranged into concern. Doctors were called, but not all at once. Lawyers were notified, but selectively. Security was tightened, but not visibly. Each choice looked responsible in isolation. Together, they formed a pattern. Inside his fading awareness, the billionaire sensed motion around him. Not chaos, but coordination. He could no longer move his hands reliably. His eyelids felt heavier than before. The room blurred in and out, shapes dissolving at the edges. But his mind remained awake, sharp enough to recognize something deeply wrong. He tried to speak. His mouth moved. No sound followed. That was when he understood the true nature of what had been done to him. This wasn't an attempt on his life. It was an interruption. A pause button pressed on the one person who could say no. Downstairs, the dining room had already transformed. Plates were cleared, glasses removed, evidence erased in the most innocent way possible. Routine. Normalcy performed with precision. Upstairs, doors opened and closed softly. People took positions. Someone sat near the bed, offering reassurance that required no response. Someone else stood near the doorway, monitoring who came and went. No one spoke too loudly. No one cried. No one asked questions that didn't already have answers prepared. Doctors arrived in pairs, not teams. Their assessments were calm, cautious, inconclusive. Symptoms were noted, vitals recorded, explanations offered, but always provisional. Uncertainty buys time, and time was the most valuable currency in the house that night. The billionaire drifted in and out of clarity. Each return to awareness brought new fragments, a hushed conversation that stopped when he stirred, a document folder placed on a desk where it hadn't been before, a phone call taken just outside the door. He wanted to scream. Instead, his chest tightened again. The pain wasn't sharp. It was oppressive, like pressure building from the inside, squeezing down on breath and agency alike. His fingers twitched uselessly against the sheets. Someone noticed. Concern was expressed, but still, no rush, because rushing would imply fear, and fear would imply guilt. Elsewhere in the mansion, quiet negotiations unfolded, not arguments, alignments, people testing where others stood, who was loyal to who needed convincing, who was already prepared. This wasn't chaos, it was choreography. Legal frameworks, long dormant, were referenced. Contingency clauses remembered, authority reassigned temporarily, signatures discussed, not yet signed. All perfectly reasonable, all perfectly timed. The billionaire's name was spoken often, but his presence was no longer required. That realization cut deeper than the physical symptoms. For decades, his power had been tied to his clarity, his ability to decide, to intervene, to halt momentum with a single word. Now, momentum was moving without him, and it was efficient. As the night stretched on, his condition stabilized, but did not improve. Stable was good enough. Stable meant delay. Delay meant opportunity. Morning crept closer in thin slices of light that filtered through the curtains. The mansion did not sleep. It waited. By dawn, the structure had shifted, not visibly, not officially, but meaningfully. Decisions had been made that could not be easily undone. Lines had been crossed that could not be uncrossed. Authority had been exercised in ways that would later be described as necessary. From the outside, it would look like crisis management. From the inside, it was something else entirely. The billionaire lay still, his breathing slow, his body heavy, his mind trapped inside a system he had built to function without weakness. He had designed his empire to survive without him. He had not designed it to remain loyal without him. And somewhere in the mansion, someone understood that better than anyone else. Truth rarely arrives cleanly. It seeps. It leaks through fractures in confidence, through moments of hesitation, through the small inconsistencies people overlook when they believe they are already safe. Inside the mansion, certainty began to decay. The billionaire's condition no longer worsened, but it didn't resolve either. Doctors used words like monitoring and waiting. They spoke carefully, avoiding conclusions that would force action. Test results took time. Specialists were consulted remotely. Nothing was declared definitive. That ambiguity kept the house in suspension, and suspension made people uncomfortable. When no one knows how long a crisis will last, loyalties begin to reveal themselves, not in grand gestures, but in timing. Who stayed close? Who left early? Who returned calls quickly? Who didn't? The first suspicion wasn't spoken aloud. It didn't need to be. Eyes lingered longer than before. Movements were watched. Conversations replayed in memory with new emphasis. A glance that once meant nothing now felt loaded. A comment overheard in passing gained weight. Everyone remembered the dinner differently. Some recalled the order in which the wine had been poured. Some remembered who insisted on refilling glasses. Some remembered who had eaten less, who had eaten more. Memory became a weapon. Downstairs, the dining room remained untouched, not because it was preserved, but because no one wanted to be the first to disturb it. The table had become symbolic, a silent witness, a reminder that whatever had happened, it had happened there. Late into the night, away from public view, toxicology reports began to narrow the field. Not poison in the traditional sense, not something violent or fast-acting. This was precision chemistry, something designed to interfere with neurological control, cardiovascular stability, muscular response, a compound that destabilized without destroying. It confirmed what the billionaire had already suspected in his fading consciousness. This wasn't meant to kill him. It was meant to neutralize him. That realization changed everything, Because murder brings urgency. Control brings patience. As this understanding spread among a select few, the atmosphere shifted. The question was no longer who tried to kill him. It became who stood to gain from him staying alive. But silent. Documents were reviewed again. Old agreements resurfaced. Temporary authority structures were reinterpreted. Clauses that had once seemed theoretical now mattered deeply. Someone had anticipated this, not the poisoning itself, but the moment. They had known exactly how long instability needed to last. The mansion's private study became the center of gravity. Safes were opened, files retrieved, papers examined with careful neutrality. Each person involved claimed responsibility while subtly limiting access. Trust thinned. Confrontations happened without shouting. Accusations were implied, not spoken. A raised eyebrow replaced an argument. Silence replaced denial. And then an inconsistency emerged. Small, technical, easy to miss. One document referenced a decision that had not yet been formally approved. A signature implied consent that could not have been given after the dinner. The timing didn't align. Someone had acted early. That discovery rippled quietly. It didn't trigger panic, but it sharpened attention. Conversations became shorter. Doors closed more often. Phones were placed face down. The truth was no longer abstract. It was close. The billionaire began to regain fragments of strength, enough to focus, enough to listen, enough to understand that his absence had not been accidental. It had been orchestrated to create space. Space for others to move. Space for control to shift. Space for irreversible decisions. As clarity returned, so did something else. Anger, not the loud kind, not explosive, the kind that settles deep and sharpens the mind. He remembered faces from the dinner, not expressions, but timing. Who had leaned in when he faltered? Who had stepped back? Who had already known? And in those memories, one presence stood out, not for what they did, but for what they didn't do. No panic, no confusion, no urgency, only readiness. The truth had not yet been spoken, but it had been seen, and once seen it could no longer be ignored. Recovery did not arrive like relief. It arrived like reckoning. The billionaire regained control of his body in increments. First his breathing, then his hands, then his voice. Strength returned unevenly, forcing patience on a man who had never needed it before. Doctors spoke of progress, of stabilization, of time. Time had already been spent. The mansion no longer felt the same, not because it had changed, but because he had. Every corridor carried memory now. Every quiet moment felt deliberate. He noticed who avoided eye contact, who lingered too long, who spoke carefully, choosing words meant to sound supportive without committing to anything real. Power had a smell to it when it moved, and it had moved. When he was strong enough to sit alone, he asked for silence, not because he needed rest, but because he needed clarity. He reviewed what had happened without emotion, without accusation. He traced the sequence backward. The dinner, the symptoms, the delay, the decisions made in his absence. Nothing had been illegal. That was the brilliance of it. Everything that had occurred had been technically justified. Authority exercised temporarily. Contingencies activated responsibly. Interests protected. All within the framework he himself had designed. The realization was sobering. He had built a system that assumed loyalty would persist in his silence. That assumption had been exploited. He requested documents next, not summaries, originals. He read slowly, deliberately, absorbing not just the content, but the timing. He saw where control had shifted, where influence had pooled, where his absence had been used as permission rather than problem. The poisoning had been precise, but the aftermath had been opportunistic. Some people had acted out of fear, others out of ambition, and one, only one, had acted with intent. Not to end him, but to replace him. He did not confront anyone immediately. That restraint unsettled the house more than anger ever could. Instead, he waited. He allowed routines to resume. He permitted decisions to continue. He watched how people behaved now that he was present again, but diminished. That observation told him everything he needed to know. Some avoided risk. Some avoided him. Some leaned in closer than before. And one person behaved exactly as they always had, confident, calm, already planning the future. That was when the final truth settled. Legacy is not what you leave behind. It's what survives without you, and who controls it. The billionaire did not expose the poisoning publicly. He did not seek revenge. He did not dismantle the system in rage. He did something far more devastating. He rewrote the future quietly. Legal structures were adjusted, authority redistributed in ways that looked logical but carried hidden weight. Succession plans changed, not dramatically, but decisively. Access was narrowed, dependencies rerouted. The person who thought they had won found themselves powerful, but isolated, elevated, but constrained. In control of a legacy they could no longer fully command. By the time the truth became undeniable, it was too late to undo. The billionaire returned to the dining room alone one morning. The table was empty now, clean, polished, harmless in appearance. He stood at the head of it for a long time, not angry, not afraid, just aware. The dinner had almost ended his life, but it had revealed something far more valuable. The real threat to his legacy hadn't come from enemies. It had come from proximity, from patience, from someone who believed silence meant surrender. He left the room knowing one final truth. Power can be taken, but legacy must be defended.